That's extraordinary. 50%. However, the costs have gone up for the treatment of someone who's had a heart attack that goes to the hospital. Why? Because we have different procedures and different medications today, but they have proven to be effective. So if I look at the system and I say there's been an increase in cost, but we've had a substantial improvement in care, is that worth it? I would say in that instance it is. But we also have situations where costs seem to go up with no reference to the increase in what they call efficacy or improved condition, either in terms of outcome or in terms of length of treatment, or in terms of increasing your lifespan. And how do we control those costs or come to some system or mechanism that tries to bring those costs down? Now, again, we're going to have question and answer, and I'm going to hear from many of you. You may disagree with me on this, but this is the way I analyze it. If you look at government-sponsored or government-run programs, and the reason I bring it up is I've had these town halls, and people have said, well, look at what happened in England, or look what happens in Canada, or look what happens in France, and so I appreciate that argument, and I will listen to it. But as I examine those programs, and you look at trying to keep costs down, there is only one option available to a government-run program, and that's called rationing. And that means you make a decision that you can no longer provide care. An example, 2.5 weeks ago, the commission in Great Britain, and its initials are NICE, it's the National, I don't know, but it's the Quality Evaluation Committee, known as NICE, and they make a determination as to whether they're going to allow particular procedures. They just decided they will no longer allow injections of pain-killing steroidal medications to people with intractable back pain. Now, tens of thousands of people in Great Britain have been receiving that. Now, I happen to have a personal stake in this game, so to speak. About 10 years ago, I had intractable back pain. The only way I was able to relieve it was with deep injections into my lower back of a steroidal medication. It actually happened 2 different times, and I had to go back each time. But it gave me relief that I could get no other way. In this particular case, according to what I have researched, the doctors who have been prescribing this and providing it still believe it should be done, but this commission has now said they can no longer do it. Now that is called rationing. Now how do we do it in a system that is not government controlled? I think what we need to do is to increase what I call transparency. That means you and I, as individual patients, consumers, whatever we want to be called, should have more information so that we can make more informed judgments, along with more choices. Now, what do I mean by that? I happen to support, among other things, the ability of anybody or their employer to look at any health insurance policy that's available anywhere in this country and sign up for it. Not just those ones. Well, I'm sorry. Wells Fargo has just come and said anybody who is parked in their parking lot will be towed. So, if any of you have your cars there, that's the only warning I can give you. So you need more information, but you need more choices. Another way of getting choices is establishing health associations, which mean it doesn't necessarily have to be tied to your employment. For instance, the Chamber of Commerce, the Knights of Columbus, the Kiwanis, the Alumni Association, creating a number of different pools that have a large enough pool so that you could negotiate and effectively bring your costs down. That would be another way of doing it. A specific example is what Safeway is now doing. Now, the CEO of Safeway runs Safeway, but he's taken it upon himself to have responsibility for the health care provided to the employees of Safeway. He's tried to make some changes. And one of the things they have done is to try and create a system whereby, and I don't have all the details of it, but this is kind of a general thing, that at the lowest level, at the first dollar care, you're given a certain amount of money that you control to use for deductibles and so forth. But that's a limited amount of money. Above that, you pay for it personally in terms of deductibles and a certain percentage. And what it has done is caused more of their employees to take a look at the cost as well as the quality. Now, they've done something else. They've tried to give their employees information so the employees can make reasonable judgments. And the example I've heard, and I don't know why they picked this particular procedure, but they did, is a colonoscopy, which those of you who are under 20 or 30 don't know anything about, but those of us below do know about. And they evidently went around to try and find the different providers, both the facility and the doctors who did perform this particular procedure, and they found out what the costs were. And it was, I think, within an hour or 2-hour radius of their corporate headquarters. And the figure that I saw in the article that was written, they found 7, and that the difference in charges ran from something like $700 to several $1,000s. So they let that information out to their employees so they could be informed consumers. Secondly, what they did was they provided incentives for their employees to get involved in healthy lifestyle programs. And that's one of the things I think we at the government level ought to require in terms of overall regulation. That insurance carriers, those who provide this, ought to be able to give discounts or ought to be able to give incentives to those people who get involved in certain lifestyles. So I mean, if you're exercising, if you're keeping your cholesterol down, if you're doing some of these things that we know lead to better health generally, you ought to be able to have an incentive for that. I would rather have that than somebody in Washington telling me what I can eat. Now, like I said, there are 2 ways to get at it. One is to try and give incentives for lifestyles without the government mandating it, and the other is in essence moving towards government mandates. And I just think if you give the American people information, if you give them sort of skin in the game so they make these decisions and they have some understanding of it, and you make sure that, you know, the catastrophic health care, the big purchase items that hit you are covered by insurance policies, that we then can have a mechanism by which we try and keep costs from exploding beyond where they should be. Now, what's the state of play in Washington, D.C.? The state of play is the Senate sort of doing their own thing. They're working back and forth. They tried to do a bipartisan thing. It's broken apart. We're trying to see what's happening. Senator Baucus has said they won't have a public option. Now they're coming back saying they are going to have a public option. They're talking. They're talking about co-ops, but there are co-ops, there are co-ops, and there are co-ops. It depends on what you're talking about. On the House side, where I serve, there are 3 major committees that have dealt with the bill. There's the Ways and Means Committee, there's Energy and Commerce, and is it Finance? Finance Committee. All 3 of them started with a base bill. All 3 of them dealt with it. All 3 of them have reported out a version of the bill. It is a majority party bill. What I mean by that is essentially it is the one written by the majority party. I happen to be the minority party. It is what is the state of play. It is basically what the President has asked them to present. There has been markup, meaning that it went through committee. It did not go to subcommittee, but went through committee process. In Ways and Means, for instance, there were 31 amendments offered by Republicans. I believe not a single one was adopted. They did it in the other 2 as well. It's basically coming to us at this point in time with a public option, among other things. There are a lot of things we can discuss on it. Let me just specifically talk about public option, and then I promise I will take your questions when we get into it. I view a public option as an inevitable precondition to a public government takeover of health care. That's my position. I will be happy to answer questions when we go through this, because I know there's some people who disagree on it. The reason I believe that is if you look at the structure of the bill, it inevitably moves in that direction by setting up incentives for the public option and disincentives for the private option, and certain tax structure on business that in my judgment will drive businesses to get rid of private and accept the public option. But why would I be concerned about a public option? Because a public option that leads to a public government single-payer program, I think, would have to follow the structure you see in other countries and the way they develop. And I was just recently in Canada. It is true that many people in Canada like what they have up there, but the incoming doctor who has just come in as the head of Canadian Medical Society, she stated, our system is in danger of collapse. It is imploding. It cannot be sustained. In the British system, the delays we talk about for procedures that you can get in the United States are fairly straightforward. But more importantly, if you look at the recent studies that have come in with successes for treatment of cancer, survival rates, and time, that is lifespan after treatment, we are far better in the United States in virtually every category of cancer than any of the other systems. When you look at that, in my judgment, it seems to me you have to ask yourself, why would I move in that direction when I can make changes in our system that don't take us inevitably there? Now, state of play. The president said last Saturday or Sunday in Colorado that public option was not absolute and used the expression that it's only a sliver of our program. Secretary Sebelius, who's Secretary of HHS, Health and Human Services, who's one of the main spokesmen for the administration on this issue, basically said on one of the television talk shows, it is not a necessary part of our program. Immediately thereafter, 3 statements came from different representatives of the White House saying, no, that's not quite true, it is still on the table. And then Robert Gibbs, who's the press secretary of the president, on Tuesday morning, basically said there's been no change in policy whatsoever. And 60 Democratic members of the House sent a letter to the president saying without a public option they will not support the bill. There are also Blue Dog Democrats, that's a group, I'm not calling them that, they call themselves that. They're moderate to conservative Democrats who said if there's a public option, they will not support the bill. So that's people, they could lose 35 of their members to vote no on this and still pass it. Now, what does that mean politically? What it means politically is they could isolate all Republicans and say you don't count, we're just going to go. In the Senate, what they tried to do is to say, no, we want a bipartisan. But Senate has unique rules. I won't go into it. All I can say is normally you need to have 60 votes to ensure that you can pass something of substantial nature. There's something called reconciliation. Again, I won't go into the details. It allows them to pass it by 51 votes. But because of the nature of reconciliation, they can't pass a whole bill. There are certain parts they have to leave out. So it would be piecemeal from the Senate if they pass it, coming to something from the House, and then you get all sorts of different variations. So if you ask, what's the bill? We don't know what the bill's going to be, but there's essentially a 1,017-page bill that came out of the 3 committees with slight variations. That's the base in the House. In the Senate, they're still trying to determine what their base is. Again, if they go by reconciliation, which in the Senate is called the nuclear option, they won't be able to put everything in that, and it will be odd as you look at the project. So there's where we are. All right, now here's what we're going to do. What we're going to do is we're going to try and, again, I thank you for being orderly. I thank you for being polite. You can be vigorous. I want you to be passionate, but please be respectful of one another. And what I'm going to try and do is first question on the left, then a question on the right, then a question outside. All right. Yes, sir.
Congressman Hunter, my name is Gary. Oh, I have to speak louder. I'm sorry.
If you'll hold the mic a little bit away so they'll catch it on TV, but loud enough for people to hear.
Okay. I happen to have been a graduate of Sarah High School. I understand you were a graduate of St. Anthony's.
Yeah, I remember we played you guys and used to beat you.
Yes, you did. There's no doubt about it. And I went to University of San Francisco. You went to Notre Dame. We both were taught by Jesuits. The only
No. Notre Dame was Catholic. Holy Cross. At Notre Dame.
Oh, they're Holy Cross. That's
yeah.
Jesuits. I'm sorry. But the one thing that I don't really understand is that out of my Catholic education, I had a strong sense of social justice.
Yes, sir.
That I don't seem to see in the Republican situation. And the fact of the matter is that 20% of all individuals younger than the age of 65 do not have health insurance at some time in the year. Check in Sacramento Bee, it can vary anywhere from 17 to 27% in the California counties of this area. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm trying. Okay. The thing that I have noticed after following this is it seems as though the election of 2008 we thought could bring about a change in the poisonous atmosphere in Washington where people could actually work on a bipartisan basis. It is fairly obvious that the Republicans are not going to vote for health care reform no matter what's in the bill. Your leadership keeps saying, look, we're going to do this, it'll just be like '93, you know, when we were able to stuff Clinton's health care, Hillary care, and thereupon returning the House. Okay, all I'm saying, this is my question. Okay, if you are serious, you know, about wanting to engage in a serious discussion about health care reform, then why have we heard about death agents, immigrants will be covered, abortion is not in the bill. That abortion, there'll be federal funding for abortion. At least be honest and say these things are not in the bill. Thank you. Read the bill. Read the bill. I have read the bill.
Let me just say,
what's the question?
the question is, there's a lack of bipartisanship in Washington, basically as a result of Republicans' intransigence. Why do Republicans not want to work together with the president on this? Why are we not telling the truth about the bill as it presently exists? And I will mention it. Now, first of all, in terms of bipartisanship, I've been to the White House twice for bill signing ceremonies invited by the president because I supported him on bills. Secondly, I am working with the president on cybersecurity in this country, a very important issue where I think he's on the right side of things, and I am trying to engage his people. We're working together to protect the American people. Third, I happen to think the president is wrong on his approach to health care. I don't want people covered. It's not that I don't want to deal with the problems that exist. I disagree profoundly with him on the way we do it. I appreciate all that, but it's going to take a long time if we do that every time. The Republicans offered 31 separate amendments. Not a single one was adopted. We have 4 major Republican alternatives, none of which was adopted, and we have no indication we'll even be allowed to offer any of them. And third, I would say, is this. You say there is nothing with respect to abortion. There is. It specifically will, for the first time, overturn the Hyde Amendment, which puts restrictions on federal funding for abortion, because the President made it clear it will be a piece of any public option. He has said that repeatedly to different groups. Secondly, if you talk about the death panel, I don't call it that, but if you want to look at someone who's not a Republican, you may have heard of Nat Henhoff, who's been writing for the Village Voice for the last 30 years, one of the great civil libertarians in this country. And he said in his article, I think it was kind of an aggressive headlining of his article, he says the first time he's ever feared his government for this reason. He said, when you take end-of-age counseling mandated by the government every 5 years, and the word is used shall, not may, that's mandatory. And you have a system in which you are concerned about costs, in which some of your top advisors have talked about how we spend too much money at people at the end of their lives. And when you have a system in which you're worried about cost, and the government that is worried about cost is counseling you about what you ought to do at the end of your life, there is the possibility of what they call white coat influence, where the doctor is suggesting to you, because the government influence, that maybe we ought not to spend this money on you and allow it to be spent on others. Now, I have no problem whatsoever with those kinds of conversations taking place between the doctor and the patient and the family. But I have a real problem where the federal government is involved in terms of the one that's supposedly spending the money and is concerned about cost. And what he has said is when you put all that together, he wouldn't call it a death panel or something, but the problem is that it is a great influence to tell people they ought not to do it. Now, about 20 years ago, there was an outstanding young governor of Colorado named Lamb, a Democratic member, a guy that I worked with on some things. And he got into this discussion, and he said, there is a duty to die.
Yeah.
That at some point in time, when you're that old, you got a duty to get out of the way of the other people. And he used an analogy of trees. He said, trees have leaves on them. The leaves fall, that's like older people, and at some point in time, you become the fertilizer for the young generation. Now, all I'm saying is, that guy was not a nut. That guy was a serious thinker, that was his philosophy, and all I'm saying is, I have problems with my government having that great power and influence, telling people, you know, you're spending a lot of money, we ought not to do it. Between family, doctor, and your own, you know, your religious advisors and so forth, absolutely. But I worry when the government takes the role in that.
Hi. I happen to be a medical success story. I have been in complete remission from ovarian cancer for 6.5 years. Parenthetically, I was rushed to the head of the track because of the size of my tumor. I do everything big. So it took 6 weeks for me to get initial treatment. And that was being rushed to the head of the line at UC Davis and the Center Cancer System were the only two who could handle the kind of cancer I was facing, or which couldn't be diagnosed until surgery, actually. But my point is that 6.5 years later, I had the same health insurance that I was paying for at that time. I was a self-employed person, so I paid for my own health coverage, and I paid, it's Blue Shield, by the way, it's not a little one, and at the end of last year, now there had not been any increases except for my age, not because I've had cancer, but my health care coverage that I was paying for was over $1,000 a month. My deductible was $5,000 a year. My pharmaceutical deductible was $500 a year, and I had co-pays. Now, I was the only health care I've had in that 6.5 years were just my regular checkups to make sure I'm still in remission, okay? But the way I figured it, that those regular checkups were costing me $20,000 a year. Now, at the end of last year, I had to face reality that I could no longer be a self-employed person. I couldn't afford the $20,000. I was really lucky. I worked really hard. I contacted everyone I knew, and I got a job. After 6 months, I got a job. I am so lucky. Okay. Okay. I'll ask the question. What I'm saying is...
No. Come on. Just let her ask the question. Just let her ask.
So, the point is, I got a job which pays barely nothing, I have to be honest. But it's worth $20,000 to me above what it pays just because now I have insurance.
Right.
My concern is, and I would have entered into that 3% that you were talking about who have no, the one that you figure has no insurance. I think there are a lot of people like me, and they're not going to be lucky enough to get jobs. But the most important thing is, I had a business for 35 years. I was successful. I had to make a major life decision just based on health care. And I think there are a lot of people in this country who have to, and I want to know why we should have to make our major life decisions just based on health care. Thank you for being here.
You have identified a very specific problem we have in the system right now, which is those who are self-employed or small business people have difficulty at times being able to get medical coverage, insurance policies at what you would consider to be reasonable rates if you compare them to what you could get if you are working for a larger employer. And the reason is, in many cases, self-employed people can't get into a pool large enough so that you can spread the risk costs involved so that you can have reasonable premiums. And that's why I, specifically dealing with that problem, would do two things. One is I would allow the development of health associations, which would allow you as a self-employed person to join an association that would have enough people in that pool so that you could have reasonable rates. And number two, what I would do is I would allow you the option of being able to purchase health policies that are available anywhere in the country, not just those that have. It would be enforced in California under California law, but they would be those policies that have been made available anywhere. In other words, it would multiply the number of opportunities you have, number one, for choice. And secondly, with health associations, you would have a greater opportunity to find a pool into which you could be a part so that you could get comparable rates to the ones you're talking about.
Excuse me, I just want to say one more thing, and that is, no insurance company wants me out. They don't want me. I'm a cancer survivor, and that's what I want you to know.
Yes, now we have someone from the outside asking a question. Yes, sir. The mic does not project, it's for TV. You have to project.
Thank you very much. Actually, it's an outside person who snuck in. I'm Dr. Bob Hartman. I'm an internist in private practice here in Edinburgh County, and I'm also the Edinburgh County Public Health Officer. And with apologies to Letterman, I would like to make my 10 common sense comments on healthcare reform. Number 10 actually, is that the status quo is unacceptable. Whether the number of uninsured people is between 9 million and 40 million is unacceptable. It's also unacceptable that our country spends 16% of its gross domestic product on healthcare at this time, and in the next 8 years it's predicted to increase to 20%. Families and individuals simply cannot afford that. Also, our health status in this country, we spend far more on healthcare than any other country, and the outcome data is not comparable to that in other countries. Number 9, whatever plan we come up with has to be revenue neutral. We simply, in this economic time, cannot afford more debt. Number 8, as Congressman Lundgren alluded to, we need more primary care emphasis. We need more public health emphasis. Less than 1% of healthcare expenditures go to public health, and yet public health is the safety net. Public health is the safety net for people who do not have what a lot of the rest of us do have. There are several things in the primary care emphasis model that seem to be working well. There's something new about the medical home model. It is cutting down costs and it is getting improved care. We need more equitable reimbursement among physicians. Primary care physicians are at the low end of the feeding chain, as Congressman Lundgren knows. And there needs, physicians are part of the problem. I'll admit that. But we need more equitable care. Number 7, we need a rural training emphasis. There are only 10 medical schools in the United States that have a bona fide rural training program. Number 6, we do need emphasis on electronic medical records. I think that the current bill overestimates any savings that would occur there. I think that at best will be revenue neutral, but we can give better care with an integrated electronic health care system. Number 4, apologies, Congressman. Our congressmen, our White House, the cabinet members need to experience what all of you experience. I would challenge those mentioned groups to get on Medicare or get on Medi-Cal for a year. See the hardships, see the difficulty in making co-payments, see the difficulty in getting into the system in a way that really flows well. Number 3, pharmaceutical companies are part of the problem. Pharmaceutical companies do absolutely wonderful research and development, but for my patients to be able to go to Mexico and buy a tube of anti-inflammatory cream for $7 and then come back to California and buy that same tube of anti-inflammatory cream for $96. The only difference being that one is labeled in Spanish, one is labeled in English, that's wrong. That needs to be a major part of any reform. Number 2, insurance companies really are part of the problem. The insurers, whether they're private insurers, whether they're public insurers, should prosper only if they are improving our health. Today insurance companies compete and prosper by selecting healthy people, by denying services, by negotiating people, by making those of us in the practice of medicine have to go through innumerable hoops on a daily basis, and shifting costs to all of us, to the subscribers. So insurance reform has to be a major portion of this. And number 1, lastly, a public option is necessary. Government shouldn't be in healthcare. It's far easier for me to work with Medicare than it is with your insurance company. So I appreciate that.
Thank you, Doctor, very much. Let me just, thank you, Doctor, very much. I appreciate your comment. I don't agree with all of them. I would say this, Doctor, point number 10 and point number 1 are in absolute conflict. The public option program, as presented in the bill, has been scored by CBO at a minimum of $1.2 trillion. There are those who suggest it will be closer to $2 trillion in the first 10 years, even with all of the additional taxes presented in this bill, which also cuts Medicare, which also cuts reimbursement to hospitals, which also obliterates the Medicare Advantage program in order to pay for the new public option. With all of that, we will still have a deficit of at least $268 billion under this program. So it is not revenue neutral. The largest expenditure in this program is the public option, and it will make it more difficult for reimbursement for Medicare Advantage, and reimbursement to the hospitals. As you suggest, there is no free lunch. And the idea that the public option necessarily provides us with the alternative that will create competition, I respectfully disagree. In terms of the pharmaceuticals have an agreement with the president to support this bill. It is the major pharmaceuticals that are on the line to spend tens of millions of dollars in advertising for this bill, and they've hired David Axelrod's former company to do the advertising, for which he's going to get $2 million. Well, he gets $2 million in severance pay from that company. During the period of time, they're going to have a contract paid for by the pharmaceuticals in order to promote the president's program. So if you want to get at the pharmaceuticals, the suggestion that you support this bill seems a little strange when it's the pharmaceuticals that are putting the biggest money behind promoting this bill. I disagree with them on that, and I have supported generics where appropriate, but I also realize that the patent laws in this country, and I serve on a judicial committee that deals with patent, has been a great boon to invention in this world. And it was a number of years ago when I served in Congress the first time that we found out that the FDA approval procedure lasted so long that it actually took up a great deal of the effective life of the patent where they could recover their money. We passed legislation on a bipartisan basis. I remember Henry Waxman was for it, Howard Berman was for it, I was for it. The Patent Restoration Act of 1984, 1986, something like that, which granted an additional period of time to the pharmaceuticals after they had gotten FDA approval, specifically for the purpose of allowing them to recoup their investment and, yes, make some money, because that's how you get people to take risks in these cases. That is an easier question than the question we're going to have that's going to be coming up. Well, it's coming up now, and that is as we move from pharmaceuticals on a chemical basis to a biologic basis, there is a question as to whether or not a company that creates a new biologic pharmaceutical product, whether the line that they create, which is based on biologic, meaning some living substance that is at the beginning of it instead of a chemical substance, whether when they produce that line, whether that same line can be produced even using the same scientific platform or same scientific blueprint. And the real question we're going to have to answer is whether we require the FDA to make any generic company go back and do the very same things that the initial patent holder had, or whether we allow them just to do efficacy studies, which means that you shorten the time and the investment of the generics so they bring it to market. So part of it has to do with the quality of the product and the question of whether or not we can prove that a generic has the same effect as the original patent does. But I have supported generics. I have supported efforts to ensure that pharmaceuticals which would have a patent and then would change the chemical composition in a minor way, but a minor way which would grant them a new patent, would then prohibit a generic from following that as they bring that forward. And so we've done some things to try and bring some sense into it. I'll just be honest with you. I don't see the doctors as villains. I don't see the insurance companies as villains. I don't see the pharmaceuticals as villains. I don't see the patients as villains. We're all in this together, folks. And we ought to at least be able to talk about it without creating the image that somebody's got to be a villain in this. We're going to take a question on this side. What gentleman right here?
Thank you. I too am a doctor. I don't completely agree with Dr. Hartman, but let me say this, and
I'll repeat it. Can't say about it.
I too am a doctor. I don't completely agree with Dr. Hartman, but I want to call Congressman Lundgren's attention to two items I think will meet approval with all of you. It's outrageous to suggest that the rest of us be required to write and pay for 12 to 20 million illegals' health care. This in itself will save money. This in itself will save money for the health care the administration is seeking. Now, what I'm about to say may not be too popular with Dan Lundgren's profession, but it's something that never seemed to be addressed too much in these discussions. The medical profession is doing an extraordinary amount of lab tests to protect themselves from being sued. May I suggest putting in place the European model that does reduce malpractice lawsuits. This would demonstrate that the legal profession's willingness to also sacrifice malpractice actions for the greater good of getting the health care costs under control.
I just want, okay, the doctor made 2 points there. One is he said that there is a cost incurred by society today with medical coverage for illegal aliens, and would a bill or would this, whatever we pass in the House, allow them to have care under the system and therefore we as taxpayers pay for it, which he disagrees with, or would it not? Well, here again is the state of play on that. And that is that in the House, there was a Republican proposal to require the people who benefited from this program, whatever the health program would be that comes out of the bill, would have to provide proof of citizenship, other than for emergency cases. That was voted down by one vote in the committee. The next day, a Democratic member brought an amendment which said illegal aliens will not get care under here, but refused to have any requirement that there was any proof of citizenship. So that's where we are right now. The second, I'm just trying to tell you where it is. And I would think that if anything passes in the House, it would have to have a strong verification of citizenship for people to receive benefits. The second question posed by the doctor was one of medical malpractice legal reform, and otherwise known as tort reform. Now, I actually did medical malpractice defense primarily for 5 years before I was elected to Congress the first time. I did a couple of plaintiff cases. I think I might have mentioned, I may have been one of the first people in the state of California to successfully sue an HMO where they did not give proper care and in fact refused care to my client, their patient, and we made a strong recovery in that regard. My belief is that, now this is based on my experience, 85% of cases have no substance. 15% have some substance. 5 actually have real merit. Now that was my general feeling, being in the field, practicing all over California, being in court, going over records. A couple of things I would say. And the doctor in the back mentioned the need for us to have IT. That is basically computerizing our systems. I happen to believe that makes sense. I do believe there will be some savings, but I think you're correct. In the early years, you won't have the savings. There's a major capital investment that has to be made. And there's some questions of how you do it, particularly with doctors who are in independent practices. But one of the things I found when I was doing these cases was that many times the hospital or the doctor got in trouble for bad record keeping. And once there was a bad record, there was no way you were going to convince a jury that there wasn't some nefarious action, something wrong done. You go back and you make an amendment to the record. People say, what are you doing there? IT doesn't eliminate all problems, but it does help get better record keeping. That would have some impact. There are ways of tweaking the system of medical malpractice which would save money and stop a lot of the defensive medicine. I would not eliminate the litigation system like Charles Krauthammer, the distinguished columnist, wrote about last week. But I'll just give you a specific example, and this goes out of cases I used to have. I oftentimes represented a hospital or a tangential defendant, and what I mean by that is there's a bad outcome in a hospital. The plaintiff's attorney, making sure that he or she doesn't make a mistake, sues everybody inside. Sues the primary care physician, sues the surgeon, sues the anesthesiologist, sues the nurses, sues the hospital, because at the beginning of the case you're not sure who made a mistake or who did something wrong. You do in California what's known as discovery. You take depositions, you send out interrogatories. And under California law, you're supposed to complete that before you start trial and before you have a settlement conference. Settlement conference, the judge calls you in, you represent your client, you sit down, you talk about your case, you see if you can settle it. Under California law, there is no penalty. After the time that you have finished discovery, there's no penalty to the plaintiff's attorney for keeping the tangential defendants in, keeping the hospital in, even though there's no liability. And oftentimes I sat in settlement conference and the judge would say to me, well, Mr. Lundgren, call your insurance carrier up and tell them to throw $5,000 or $10,000 in. And I would say, well, thank you, Your Honor, but there's no record, there's no suggestion that my client has done anything wrong. He said, I know, but it is the cost of litigation. It'll be cheaper for them to spend $10,000 than to have you sit in court for 2 weeks until the jury finds there's no liability. Now, one of the tweaks I would have is I would create a situation which, at the time of settlement, after you've done discovery as required under California law, and you are the defense counsel, you would present to the judge at that time a proof that there was no evidence of substantial nature against your client. You would say to the judge, Your Honor, I want to put the plaintiff on notice and you on notice that if at the time of jury decision there is no case against my client, that you will require all costs involved in this case from the beginning of the case to be paid by the plaintiff and or the plaintiff's attorney. Now, at that point in time, the judge at settlement conference has some power to balance the interests. Now, I understand what plaintiff's attorneys are going to say. They're going to say, hey, you let these people out. The doctor who really did screw up or the hospital that really did screw up is going to point to everybody who's out and say, they did it. Well, you know, that's part of the facts of life. I mean, you just have to deal with that. I think that change could bring down a lot of the additional costs involved, because the real cost, the cost of litigation prior to trial cost a lot, but if you go to trial, it costs a lot. And if you could eliminate that, you would eliminate the need for some of this defensive medicine that's out there in the sphere of litigation. So I agree with you, we need tort reform. There are other proposals for tort reform. That's my proposal for tort reform. That and a few other things that I think would help. Okay, we're going to have somebody on this side, on the right side. Pick them out there. And for those who are out in the parking lot, they can hear me. Okay, well, I hope you'll tell them that after we finish here, an hour and a half, I will go out there for a half hour and try and talk with them as well.
Got that all set.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Sir, first I want to thank you for coming today. I appreciate your time. And from what I'm hearing, we pretty much, from on my health care. And I want to know, sir, from the polls I see, contrary to some of these signs, most Americans do not want the government controlling their health care. And I want to know, will you and your fellow members in the House that agree with us please represent us and not concede to government control, increased taxes, cap and trade, and just putting this government and this country in further debt and further...
I could just say yes, and that would be the end of it. Let me say this. There is no perfect system. As I said, I remember my dad arguing with insurance companies. And I remember him winning a lot of those arguments, but he didn't win all of them. Most insurance companies have an appeal process, but ultimately you also have, and I know it's difficult, but you have the option of suing them. You don't have the option of suing the federal government if they make a decision against you. Secondly, look, I've been involved in government for a good portion of my adult life. I obviously am not anti-government. I want a government that's small, lean, effective, robust, and does what it needs to do. But when a government tries to do everything, it can't do anything well. And we have now, the administration just came out this morning with a new estimate of the size of the additional debt that will be added in the next 10 years. It is not 6-point-something trillion dollars. It is 9-point-something trillion dollars. And I'm telling you, we cannot afford it. Now, I'm not calling this socialism, so I don't want anybody to say I did, but there's a very interesting comment made by Prime Minister Thatcher of England. She said the problem with socialism is sooner or later you run out of other people's money. I voted against both times we had the Cash for Clunkers program. I voted against it both times. People come up to me and say, what's the matter? It's a great idea. $4,500. You're going to get people buying cars. I said, where did the $4,500 come from? The problem is too often we take this in and we hand you a check for $4,500, but we hold behind our back the bill. And the bill with interest is going to go on your children and your grandchildren. I'm holding up to have grandchildren now, and I can't look them in the face and say, yes, we have this money to spend. If you have cash for clunkers, why not cash for TVs? Why not cash for refrigerators? There's a famous French economist of yesteryear, Frederick Bastiat, who said this. That's not the only definition of the state, but he was referring to a certain view of it. He said the state is that great fictitious entity by which everyone seeks to live at the expense of everyone else. And what we need to do is understand that with freedom comes responsibilities, that we are our own agents. We ought to try and take care of ourselves first. There are those who will not be able to take care of themselves for whatever reason, through no fault of their own. We should create safety nets to help them, but we ought not to create incentives to take certain responsibilities away from individuals or to try and move from the private sector to the public sector on some mistaken belief that magically it's going to be cheaper. Government does some things well. It does other things very poorly, and some it cannot do at all. And what I'm trying to say is if you're going to try and deal with a budget in a deficit, in a huge debt, think of it this way. We used to argue that the difference between state governments and federal governments was the state governments couldn't print their own money. But what happened in California this year? We printed IOUs, which essentially is currency. What happened after 2 months? The banks stopped taking them. The biggest holder of our debt in the world today is China. The second largest is Japan. The third largest is the collection of oil-producing countries around the world. Do you ever think that China might at some time think, as the Bank of America did, we're not going to redeem your currency or your debt anymore? And at that point in time, there's nobody to appeal to. We ought not to put ourselves in that position. We ought to understand that as responsible adults, we have the obligation to exercise discipline and to think about our children. My parents went through, I mean, they're part of the greatest generation. My dad is now deceased. My mom is 92. They went through the Depression. They went through World War II. They went through the Cold War. That generation defeated polio, completed the eradication of smallpox, put a man on the moon, brought us the Civil Rights Revolution, defeated communism, and they didn't do it by looking for somebody else to do it. Yes, left side, right side, or outside? Outside, yes ma'am. No, that mic does not help you in this room. That's only for TV, so we need to hear you, but hold the mic so they can hear you as well. There you go.
Walk to the front and use his mic.
I want to know why we can't send the 12 million illegals in this country back to their country and not give them health care and social security benefits.
The question is, why can't we send the 12 million people who are here illegal back to their home country and not give them health care and social security benefits? I've spent 31 years on this issue. I have dealt with it from one end to the other. The first problem we have is we're not facing the problem. The second problem is we've not done enough to enforce our borders, but we are actually beginning to do far more than we have ever done before, and it is becoming more effective. And that, in addition to the downturn in our economy, has dramatically dropped the number of illegal aliens attempting to enter this country and who are successfully entering. There is the question of what we do. When we come up with some sort of plan, we're going to have to deal with it sometime or other. When we complete the initiative to do a better job of securing our borders, not only because of illegal immigration, but also because of the threat of terrorism. When we complete that, what we do in terms of a program to allow whatever temporary workforce we need as we identify as Americans through our government, how we structure that program so in my judgment it would be a temporary program so people come here temporarily without the expectation of staying here, while we also keep the flow of legal immigration open, and we have done that country after country, and frankly, I am not a descendant of Native Americans, so my predecessors came here from Ireland and from Sweden, and I want this country to continue to be the beacon of hope and the greatest place where people want to come, as long as we control how that is done. But then the question is, what do you do with those people who have been here a substantial period of time, have roots in our community, have not broken the law? Some people say, as the president, haven't otherwise broken the law. Some people say, as the president has said, we need to put them on the path to citizenship. I don't think that is what we need to do. I think we ought to look at a program that might give them a temporary status that they can renew on a multi-year basis, that they would be allowed to do things in this country so long as they do a number of things, take a course in English, take a course in civics, pay taxes, etc. But if they ever want to become citizens, get on the road to citizenship, they return to their home country and get at the end of the line, like everybody else does. don't think that you automatically then say anybody who stays under that process gets public option or anything else. I mean, the American taxpayer is having trouble paying his or her own bill, and we're having trouble providing health care for our own people here. And while we would never deny health care to someone on an emergency basis, I don't think there's an obligation that if you get your foot over the line, you necessarily have to take care of all your health care needs. Okay, why don't we get somebody in the middle? Is she in the middle?
I was on the outside.
Was she an outsider?
Yeah, but I'm an insider. I want to thank you for coming, and I want to thank you for breaking down that 42 million, 47 million population for us. And I just wanted to let you people know that the bill as it's written, if anybody's written C-3200, it has involved in it the Secretary of Labor, the Secretary of Treasury, the Secretary of Human and Health Services, the Secretary of Defense. There's going to be a new Commissioner for Health Choices by Obama, new Health Benefits Advisory Committee by Obama, new Health Insurance Ombudsman that reports to Congress, Commissioner of Health Insurance by Obama, new Special Inspector General by Obama, Medicare Beneficiary Ombudsman operating under Social Security Act, Inspector General for the Department of Health and Human Services by Obama, Chief Actuary for the Center of Medicare and Medicaid Services, Institute of Medicine will conduct a study to find out how the health care is for people that can't speak English. And finally, Secretary of Health and Human Services shall enroll 30 eligible providers who have experience to implement shared decision-making end-of-life choices using patient decision aids. So we got government all over. We don't need to stay. I don't have a question. I'm important.
Well, here's the point. Wait a minute. Here's the point I want to make. This chart is one we developed. It is on the Republican staff side, our joint economics. It's the chart I had to fight as the chairman of or as the Republican top member on House Administration to allow us to even present this to you, because the majority originally wouldn't even allow me to go to Kinko's to pay for this so you can see it. I'm serious, but it presents the 53 different agencies, departments, and programs that are either brand new or have enhanced power under the new bill, or the bill as it currently stands. And frankly, this is where the health care provider is, and that's where you are. I just have difficulty with that level of bureaucratic entanglement with the government. As much as I say I've been involved in government a lot of my life, I just don't think that is helpful. All right.
On an education question. You need a question from this side.
Which side? Over here? No,
This side, she was on.
Our side.
yeah. Okay, well. One question over here, then I'm going to take a question from this gentleman here who said he wants someone under 40 to ask a question. Sorry. And then we'll go outside.
I just want to know.
Okay, the mic doesn't help you.
I know. You told me that. I just want to know, will the Congress be exempt from this health care?
Yes.
Well, very, very interesting question. There was a Republican amendment that was offered in one of the three committees to say that members of Congress would be under it. It was defeated. There was another amendment offered in another committee in which it was adopted. And then in the third committee, it wasn't voiced at all. So what will come to us in the floor, I do not know at this point in time. But it goes back, when I first went to Congress in 1979, I said, if Social Security is such a great deal for everybody, why didn't Congress in it? Yeah. And in 1982, although it wasn't my bill, although that was the first or second bill I introduced, we put Congress in the Social Security system. It just seems to me that if we think an option which is going to be finally what's going to happen, that maybe Congress ought to experience that as well. Thank you very much. Now, here we go. We had a request that somebody under 40 ask a question. I don't know if you're presuming that no one was under 40 here.
I didn't mean that in any ill offense, guys, gals. My question is simple, okay? And I would like a really simple answer to my question. When the Republican Party was the majority of Congress and in the Senate, why didn't they pass like you support that people shouldn't be discriminated against pre-existing conditions. Why didn't you guys pass that when you guys were the majority?
Well, the answer is we passed about 3 different, the question was why when the Republicans were the majority, we didn't pass something that dealt specifically with pre-existing conditions.
Simply that they can't discriminate against them.
Well, it's not as easy as that. The question is, how do you handle the problem? For instance, if you have an absolute rule that insurance companies can't make any decision with respect to pre-existing conditions, what is the incentive for anybody to have insurance before they're sick? What you would do, the smart thing to do, is not pay premiums when you're not sick. When you get sick, immediately